Everybody, welcome to today's webinar. We are so pleased that you could join us. I am Allison O'Connor. I'm with CSU Extension in Larimer County. My cohorts today are Cassie Anderson from Adams County Extension, and our presenter will be John Murgel from Douglas County, who I'll introduce in just a couple of minutes. I will say, though, that John is a very talented musician, an organ player, and he probably could play that song with amazing gusto. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that CSU Extension is an equal opportunity access and non-discrimination university. If there's anything we can do to accommodate your needs, please let us know. You can also visit the website for more information. A few housekeeping things. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, so if you need to leave or you want to go back and review materials that John is going to share with us, it will be then posted to planttalk.org/webinars. We will put that into the chat because that is also where you can watch previously recorded webinars and then register for anything that's upcoming. And then we ask you to also use the Q&A for questions. And Cassie and I will be on the back end answering those questions as we're able, or when John is finished, we will toss them to him. A couple of other classes you may be interested in. Right now there is a series going on every Friday through April and May called What's Eating Your Plants? And this is a series from our diagnostic team. And actually, I think Cassie is teaching one of those in May on vegetables, perhaps. Yes. Coming up this Friday, April 11th, Emerald Ash Borer, Japanese Beetle the Friday after. You can see all of those. We will put this into the chat so you can see what's coming up and register. And as always, these are also recorded for you if you can't make it live. And with our Wednesday webinar series next month on May 14th, Eric Hammond will join us for the top trees for Colorado landscapes. And you can also register for that one and join us in May. So lots of gardening information. You will not get bored. And without further ado, let me introduce you to John Murgel, who is the Horticulture and Natural Resources Specialist in Douglas County, an accomplished organ player, and really just a guy who knows a lot about many different things. So without further ado, John, I will let you take it away.
Thanks, Allison. There it is. All right, perfect. Thanks, everybody, for being here today to talk about how to use as little energy as possible while gardening. So this is, if you, like me, are inherently lazy, this is the webinar for you, because we're going to talk about how to put your garden energy to good use. So why did I call this plant Judo? Well, because Judo is a martial art that really relies on using your opponent's energy to prevail. So if somebody's coming towards you, you might actually pull them towards you, but then throw them over your shoulder and across the room. So you use your opponent's energy in order to win. And so in a garden setting, we are going to use a plant's natural tendency to reduce the amount of work that we have to do. And this all feeds into putting the right plant in the right place. So if you've been to webinars that I've delivered before, or if you, then you probably know that this is something I like to talk about a lot. And you might hear some recurring themes today that I like to discuss all the time because I think they are worth hearing. So today, I want to talk through some of these recurring themes that we hear both at the Extension office, but also just as gardeners talking to other folks. Basically, I'd say we have three things that we're after in our gardens. We want healthy plants and we want them to do what we expect them to do, right? So I planted a tomato plant and I want tomatoes. That would be a plant doing what we expect. We don't want weeds and we don't want pests. And that's three simple things that we would like to have. And you can find lots of information on the internet and printed books and from CSU Extension and other cooperative extension services that are all about these three things, ultimately. So as I was thinking about how to structure this webinar, I thought, well, I could start going through all of our recommendations and talking about why they work or don't work. And I thought that would actually take me probably years to do, and then the webinar would last at least a week. So instead of going play by play down every recommendation we make, I am going to talk about achieving our garden dreams of plants meeting expectations without weeds or pests, just with these three main actions that we can take to get there. So we're going to talk today about plant selection, we're going to talk about mulch, and we're going to talk about conservation biocontrol, or really invertebrates in the garden, talking about how to use naturally occurring invertebrates to help you with pest control. Now, as I'm talking through this stuff, feel free to, again, throw questions in the Q&A. Cassie and Allison can answer those, and then I'll be taking time at the end to answer questions. One model of education that I would like to be certain to avoid today is where the notes of the teacher become the notes of the student, having passed through the brains of neither. And so if I say something that seems ridiculous, please call me out on it. And if you take nothing else today, I would say, remember always to be evaluating information you read on the internet or anywhere else critically. Because remember, as Abraham Lincoln famously said, you can't trust everything you read online. So let's look at our first simple goal as gardeners, which is we want healthy plants that are meeting our expectations. They're doing what we want them to do. And in order to meet expectations, we got to have some expectations. And so the first step towards being able to use garden judo, using your energy in the most efficient way possible, is that you have to know what you're trying to do. So your garden should have objectives. And if you haven't explicitly identified your objectives, perhaps not for the whole landscape as a goal, because that could be pretty nebulous, like I want it to be pretty, right? But certainly for sections of the landscape or individual plants, we might have some very discrete goals, like I need to screen the street or my neighbor's house, or I want a harvestable product out of this, like cut flowers or tomatoes, or I want a lawn to play croquet on, or to play frisbee with the dog on. I want something beautiful to look at out the kitchen window. All of those are objectives that we can define and then measure how we're going to get there and decide, all right, what can we do and what will be the least energetic way to get there? We're going to pick plants that are going to help us meet our goals, right? So we want plants that are excited to be on the team, that are ready to play. We don't want plants that are divas, that are going to take more energy than we have to expend on them. And this is important. Remember, objectives are key. So start with objectives, because if you don't know where you're going, it really doesn't matter how you get there. So if you're just wandering around out on the tatami mat, to use my judo metaphor similarly, it really doesn't matter what techniques you might use if you don't know what you're trying to accomplish while you're out there. So again, your plant objectives might be, hey, I want something pretty, I might want tomatoes, etc. And your plant objectives might be also to overcome a garden problem. And these things can be mutually reinforcing. So many folks gardening, both in Colorado and elsewhere, face problems like insects and disease on their plants. You might have limited growing space. We all have to deal with the weather. Your soil might have poor drainage. It's dry in Colorado, at least in most parts of it. We've got high pH. You might have salty soil. All of those things can be addressed by choosing the right plant. So if you pick a plant that is ready to grow in the environment you have, you no longer have that problem. Really, the only site-specific problem that you might have that can't be fixed just by choosing the correct plant to put there is compaction. So we know that plants are really powerful things. There are thousands and thousands of types of plants that we can grow in our gardens in Colorado. So of course, when we head out to the nursery, we have our list of objectives and our list of site challenges and our very specific and carefully lined up overlapping Venn diagram of which plants will fit the bill. And of course, that's in many cases not true, because when I go to the garden center, I am as susceptible to impulse buys and pretty things as the next person, I'm sure. But when we do choose plants, right, we still have to run them through a number of filters to decide which will be the best one for me. The first filter that we put things through is often the USDA hardiness zone, right? What zone are we in, and is the plant going to die in the winter here? So here's the zone map from 2023. You can see that most of the Front Range is in zone 6. Got some sections of zone 4 and 5 in Colorado, and even some 7 over on the western slope. Those are going to inform which plants, in a very general sense, might live through a winter. But if you've been gardening here for any amount of time, you know that the USDA zone is not the end-all be-all of plant selection, because there are always those rare exception plants that seem to squeak through, even though they shouldn't, according to the USDA zone. And then there are plants that should be fine that croak. And so we know that it's not just about absolute minimum cold tolerance that's making a plant succeed or fail. Another measure that we might use, another large-scale filter, would be the ecoregion that a plant is from. What's the natural habitat of that plant like? Whether it's native or not, plants grow in certain types of environments. So the ecoregion, again, is generally similar ecosystems. This screenshot is from the EPA map of ecoregions in the United States. And you can see here in Denver and Fort Collins, most of the Front Range, we're at ecoregion number 25. What you'll notice is the high plains. We're there with Cheyenne, and Amarillo, Texas, right down in here, is also in the high plains. And that means that we grow exactly the same plants in Cheyenne, Denver, and Amarillo, right? Of course, you're all laughing now. That's ridiculous. We don't grow the same plants there because ecoregion also, although it can be a general filter about what sorts of plants might grow, it's not going to be the end-all be-all of what plant is going to survive in your particular garden or landscape site. And that's because talking about two different issues of scale. We've got plant habitats in general, so that would be something like the ecoregion or the USDA zone. Then there are the plants themselves, which don't actually grow in USDA zones or ecoregions. Plants grow in a patch of ground that's about as big as the plant is, the place where it can actually access resources and where it is directly experiencing weather. So here, for example, in this picture, got grass, got oak trees. There's a reason that the oak trees are over here and not over here where the grass is. And in order to be successful with plant selection, we want to understand as much as possible why the grass is growing where it's growing and why the oak tree is where it's growing, or those analogs in our own garden, in order to make sure that that plant is as happy as possible. Because a happy plant that's growing in the right place, is a plant that needs minimal care for the gardener. So that's, again, where if I get the right plant from my site, I have just made my gardening life a heck of a lot easier. So foundational for doing this is understanding your soil. The webinar previously with Kareen was talking about soil and growing things from the ground up, because soil really is important. You may remember this either from high school geography or from a webinar or book you've read. Soil texture is the amount of clay, silt, and sand that is in a particular soil. And this, based on the mineral parentage of wherever you are, influences water dynamics through the soil, your soil structure, that is how the soil can be put together into larger particles that biology can interact with. And of course, it impacts soil compaction and influences soil compaction. So it's a good thing to understand your soil texture, because that's going to help you understand what sorts of plants might be most naturally adapted to grow where you're growing. But it doesn't stop with texture, because particularly in the built environment, texture can get really weird. So for example, in this picture you can see here, this is a home that's being built in a neighborhood that I drive by from time to time. And you can see that that's going to present some unique challenges to the gardener of this residence. Soon after this picture was taken, a landscape truck rolled in with some topsoil and covered this up and made it a nice smooth dome. And then they planted some trees. And I'm going to be really interested to watch how those trees behave, because as you can see, we've got some interesting texture variability in the soil that's underneath that surface. Part of that is soil structure. So how are the particles held together in each of these layers and in your garden? And another part is soil nutrition, or how rich is that soil? What could a plant extract from the soil given that there's given enough moisture? So you might take a soil test. So if you're just gardening in a new place, If it's been a while since you've taken a soil test, say 5 or 10 years, it might be time to submit one. You can use the Colorado State University lab. There are lots of commercial labs out there too. The soil test is going to run you, 25 to 50 bucks plus shipping, depending on where you get it. And you're going to get a lot of really useful information about your site that, again, is going to help you pick plants that are uniquely suited for your site. In this soil test result, you can see I've got a moderately salty site with high pH and extremely high nutrients. This means that this is not a site that I would want to plant, a really stress-tolerant, salt-sensitive plant, but I'm looking for something that is more competitive, right? Because I've got a lot of nutrients. This is in some ways like a party situation in the soil. So lots of stuff available. So I want plants that can take advantage of that. So when we're evaluating soil, in addition to that soil test, you want to get some ideas about your site. There are 3 things that you can do at home that would be useful, that would give you really practical information about what sorts of plants might grow or what you might need to do to a site in order to succeed with plants if there's one in particular that you want to grow. They involve soil texture, soil drainage, and then your soil bulk density, which is a measure of compaction. And remember, soil compaction is the one thing that I can't solve with plant selection. So if I find out that my soil is compacted, that's when I want to take steps to ameliorate the compaction before planting. So in order to get your soil texture, there are 2 ways to do this, in addition to just getting a soil test, which will tell you your soil texture on the results. One is the feel method. If you use the soil texture by feel, you don't need much. You need maybe a plate or a bucket, some water, and a handful of soil. You can find instructions for how to do this online. Ultimately, it means making like a blob of Play-Doh, texture of soil, seeing how long of a ribbon you can make of the soil, which tells you how much clay is in it, and then evaluating it for grittiness, which tells you how much sand is in it. And that'll give you an idea of where you are on that soil texture map. Another way that I think is easier is to use the jar method. And to do that, you just need a straight-sided jar, and again, a handful of soil and some water. You put the soil and the water in the jar, and you shake the heck out of it so that when the soil settles back out, you have some easily measurable layers of sand, silt, and clay particles that you can then just do some arithmetic to find your percentages to put yourself on the soil triangle. And that's a great way to get an idea of your soil texture in your site. So you know, hey, I've got sandy loam or I've got clay loam. Lots of folks in Colorado automatically say, oh, I have awful clay soil. The fact of the matter is, a lot of people don't have awful clay soil. A lot of people have clay loam or even sandy loam that's just been compacted. And so understanding what you're dealing with, compacted soil, is very different than saying I have clay soil. So get that soil texture test done so you know what you're dealing with. The next thing to test is soil drainage, which you can do by digging a hole that is going to be about the size of a plant root ball. So you're talking about a foot deep or so for perennials. You want to make sure your soil is nice and wet when you do this. So fill that hole with water a few times. Then when you're ready to test, fill the soil with water, mark the water line, and then go to lunch. And then come back and measure where your water line is again. And if your soil is draining, if that water line is going down less than 4 inches an hour, then you officially qualify as having poorly drained soils. And that tells you that you need to have plants that can tolerate poorly drained soils in order to succeed the best. Lastly is soil bulk density, which is again going to give us an idea of how compacted the soil is. This is the one that needs the most materials because you need to take a known volume of soil and then weigh it. And it needs to be dry when you weigh it. So short pipe section, say a fence post pipe, something galvanized, don't recommend PVC because you're going to be hammering this pipe into the ground with your wood block and your hammer or mallet. If you've got something that's made out of plastic, you might smash it to bits rather than get it into the ground. You can use your soil knife or a shovel to remove that cylinder of soil from the ground. And you can put that soil then into a bag. And then you're going to put that soil onto a plate and microwave it. Or you can put it in an oven for a while, say 250 degrees. It's much faster to use the microwave. You know, microwave it a few seconds, like 30 seconds to a minute at a time. After each microwaving, you are going to weigh that sample of soil. When the soil sample stops losing weight, you know that it is dry, and you can weigh that with your kitchen scale to a gram. Then, using the volume formula for a cylinder, you can get the number of grams per cubic centimeter of your soil. That number is typically going to be between 1 and 2. The closer to 2 it is, the worse off you are. In most soil textures, you want that to be 1.6 or less. You can find a USGS table that has all that information for your soil texture, and you can know I'm officially compacted, and that's going to impact my root growth. If you find yourself at those high numbers, there's easy things you can do like aerate. You can spade the soil up to try to get additional air and water into the soil, again, to mitigate that compaction. So we've talked now quite a bit about getting to know your site, and that's all well and good, but it's only helpful if we then know what sorts of plants might appreciate what sort of site we have. So now we have to spend some time getting to know our plant options. And there are a number of ways that you could do this. If you're an experienced gardener, you may already know quite a bit about plants. If you're brand new or new to Colorado, there are great places that you can start, including garden books. You really want to get fancy, you can get a flora or a monograph of plants that grow in a particular place. So you can grab the Flora of Colorado and read about Colorado native plants. It will describe where the plant grows in the wild. And that's going to tell you what sort of garden habitat that plant might like to grow in. The web databases, you head down to the library and start reading peer-reviewed literature on individual species. That might be for the overachiever in the crowd. And then most important, I think, is visiting other gardens and talking to other gardeners about what they've experienced growing different plants. So this is where public gardens, garden tour days can make a big impact in understanding what sorts of plants might do well. But regardless of where you get your plant information, there are 2 points from the natural world that I would always bear in mind. Because remember, our gardens are in the natural world, and if we want to take advantage of how plants naturally grow so that we don't have to do as much work, we want to remember that plants will grow anywhere they can. So look at some natural areas around you and see how many plants are there. Do I have a wall-to-wall carpet of plants? Are plants really sparse? That's going to suggest the proper planting density in your garden to fill all of the spaces available for plants. The old adage, nature abhors a vacuum, applies here. And then second, when you're filling all of your empty spaces, you want to match your plant's life strategy to the growing conditions of your site. Or if you prefer, put the right plant in the right place. And this is because if we have a good plant assemblage, community of plants in a habitat, it can be stable or unstable. A stable plant community is like what most of us see in wild or undeveloped places. There are a number of plants growing there. They are all sharing politely or fighting over the resources, and every available resource is being used. The plants that are there are typically adapted to the stresses that they experience, such that the environment for the plants is actually not stressful at all, right? They're growing there because they like it there. We might call it stressful, like, oh, it's hot and dry. The plant says, this is perfect. An unstable plant community is going to have ecological vacancies, right? We're leaving money on the table for organisms to use, and plants might not be well suited to be growing in those conditions. If we know what plants need to succeed, we can design communities of plants for our gardens that are going to meet our landscape goals. We have to know how plants are going to behave. And at this point, you might be saying, how plants behave? What are you talking about? Plants don't behave. Plants sit and grow. What I mean is what life strategy a plant uses. This is based on an ecological theory that was developed by a guy named J. Philip Grime back in the 1970s. And he said, in general, plants can be classified as competitors, stress tolerators, or ruderal plants. Now, we made, of course, 3 very neat and tidy categories, and plants exist across a spectrum of these. So you're not always going to find a plant that's, oh, it's a perfect competitor, but you'll find these strategies used in combination. In general, and we'll talk more about this momentarily, ruderal plants are weedy plants that rely on disturbance. Those are what are going to fill a disturbed area first, because they really like to have that disturbance happen. Then, depending on how rich a site is, what the nutrient levels are like, the plants that will dominate tend towards either stress-tolerant plants in nutrient-poor and dry areas, or competitive plants in nutrient-rich and wet areas. Competitive plants, because they like those nutrient-rich, damp areas, as you might imagine, they respond to resources. There's resources and fertilizer there, they're going to use them. These plants last a long time. So a classic example around here are cattails, which you can see invading here what was doubtlessly billed as a xeriscape down in Castle Pines. I know they're overwatering their xeriscape because it's being invaded by cattails. That only happens if there's ample water. So there are two things that are going on here. One is what I suspect, an irrigation leak or just a bad irrigation schedule for that turf grass. Or two, somebody really misread the natural occurrence in this garden. There is a super high water table that nobody knew about when they planted this xeriscape. The garden judo ways to deal with this is either, if it is an irrigation leak, get that thing fixed, fix your irrigation clogged. If it is a high water table, though, it is time not to have a xeriscape here. As trendy as it is to put in Colorado scaping and drought tolerant landscaping, this is a place for competitive plants if it's that wet naturally. In contrast, again, in nutrient poor or dry places, we'll see stress tolerating plants dominate after disturbance ends. These plants are adapted to low resources, and they typically have made a trade-off of being able to withstand those low resource situations by not growing very quickly or by not being able to use more if you give it to them. So these are plants that don't want to drink from a fire hose. Their straw is only so big, right? Whereas competitive plants can increase the size of their straw. And as I mentioned, ruderal plants are those plants that rely on disturbance. Individual plants don't live for very long, but they persist as seeds. And these can be both weeds, as you see here on the left with Borealisum, which is flirting with being listed as a noxious weed in Colorado, or Penstemon strictus, the Rocky Mountain penstemon here on the right. Both of these plants rely on disturbance to succeed. So if we think about what kind of environment, what habitat we're setting up in our garden, what sort of plants should grow in those places? Here's a great example in a wild area down close to my office, where you can see in the foreground, we have a huge patch of Verbascum thapsus, the woolly mullein, noxious weed. It is a ruderal plant. It loves disturbance. Scrub oak or gamble oak mitigation was conducted in this area. So we came in and we ground out the scrub oak for fire mitigation. And that disturbance created the ideal habitat for ruderal plants. You can see beyond the disturbed area, there's no woolly mullein to be seen. It's only where the habitat was ideal. Knowing what kind of soil is here, whether it's resource rich or resource poor, would allow me to predict what sorts of plants I expect to start showing up later. But knowing that I was causing a giant soil disturbance in the first place would have allowed me as a land manager to insert some more desirable ruderal plants into this situation to then make my life as a weed manager easier. This plays out on a smaller scale in our gardens all the time. So understanding your site so that you can choose plants of the correct life strategy is important. As I mentioned, plants don't neatly line up in these categories perfectly, but they do typically have a dominant strategy that they will use. Here are some common garden plants, and the strategy based on some data verified modeling that you can easily find. Describing life strategies. So Delosperma, ice plant, strategy is S for stress tolerant. And that shouldn't surprise us as a succulent. Like many succulents, these are designed to be growing in hot, dry areas. If I look at things like the Mexicali hybrid penstemons, like Pikes Peak Purple or Red Riding Hood, or a number of those plant select Mexicalis, also stress tolerant, but a flexible plant. Notice with competitive strategies, this is why they can perform well in a standard perennial garden situation. Similarly, for hopflower oregano or Centranthus ruber, Jupiter's beard or false valerian, using similar strategies. Notice, however, that the Jupiter's beard has strong ruderal tendencies, which is going to tell me that if I disturb things, it's going to seed around a lot. And if you've grown that plant before, you know that if you leave open niches and vacancies, and if you water it, disturb it, you can have a lot of it really quickly. A plant like this, growing in a leaner environment, something that's nutrient poor or drier, is less likely to become sort of the garden thug that that plant has a reputation for being. And then Convolvulus arvensis, everyone's favorite weed, bindweed, right? Notice it is relying on disturbance and it likes nutrients. So let that inform how you might try to manage bindweed. Here are some examples of local public landscapes, garden scale, showing some ways that we might misapply these ideas about nature abhorring a vacuum and putting the right sorts of plants in habitats. So here you can see we've got lots of open spaces, lots of cards on the table, money on the table rather, for resource use by other plants. In this shot in particular, you can see back here the number of plants that the area would naturally support if left to its own devices. And you can see what we're doing in the garden area. This should tell you, your powers of prediction should be letting you know weed management probably on the list of maintenance for this garden because plants are going to be coming in here to make their homes. Here's another example of a garden. This is down at the Spur campus. You can see how widely spaced these plants are. Here's a picture of the Sonoran Desert. Plants are more densely packed in the Sonoran Desert than they are here in our garden, which we're watering out the wazoo, by the way. So what can I predict will be a result in this garden? Weed management, right? Unless I change my management strategy, pick different plants or plant them more densely. Another example, we should be getting used to this. Here's what vegetation can naturally be supported. Here's what we planted. What will happen? That's right. I'm going to have weeds to manage. And this is a weed management situation that I would not wish on my worst enemy. Importantly, don't let garden style get in the way of applying this. So oftentimes, and I recognize that most of the pictures I've shown you, and when I talk about this in other places, most of these are sort of wild, the new lingo now is maximalist gardens, right? So in this picture, you can see, yeah, we've got plants all over the place and there's no discernible style. For some folks, this just reads as a mess. And yeah, I'll admit that. Yes, that is not a formal, tidy garden style, but every niche is filled. If you look here on the right, though, this is a formal garden style that still has filled every niche with plants that are well suited to growing where they're growing. So don't assume that in order to apply this, you need to change from your very formal garden style into something less formal. No, you can still do this, but by filling all your ecological niches with plants that are well suited for growing there, you will be able to spend less time pulling weeds or replacing plants or trying to convince them that, hey, you really do want to grow here. I picked our plant for our site, it's happy, and now we're happy. Here is an example of a road median, a parking lot median. And you can say, all right, well, it's pretty easy if I've got my plants in rows, I can have these blank spaces and that's easy enough to manage. So I don't see what the big deal is here and why I would need to fill those niches. And you're right, you could manage this and say, nope, the plants, obviously I have 9 grasses planted in a grid. They're cute, I have a shrub and a tree, what more could you want? But if you look very closely right here, you will see that I have a developing problem. I have quack grass, which has found its way into this garden. And because the quack grass very cleverly started growing right where one of the desirable grasses are, it's getting overlooked by weed management, right? So we're not going to notice when this happens. And this is, again, a pernicious weed problem that, if left to its own devices, will fill this entire blank spot. This is work now to maintain. Or I have to accept quack grass, which I definitely don't want to do. If I can nip this quack grass in the bud, a strategy to prevent myself from having to continually go back there and treat this weed would be to plant something competitive that's going to fill all those niches so that there's just not space for the quack grass to roll into. Which leads us right into the second thing that we want. In addition to plants meeting their expectations, right, we said we don't want any weeds in our garden. And you might be saying, well, why don't I just use the easy way? I can go down to the hardware store and I can buy the spray stuff and I just walk out there and I spray it and the weeds are gone. And yes, however, the easy way is expensive. It doesn't always work, and it can cause collateral damage. So here's a really unfortunate consequence of the easy way, where we sprayed a weed killer on these rocks. Look how clean they are. And whoops, we killed our tree. So when we're managing weeds or pests, we're going to be thinking about the IPM, or Integrated Pest Management Pyramid. You've probably seen this because this framework for thinking about how to manage pests has been around for a while. And the idea is that you want to start foundationally with cultural practices, putting the right plant in the right place, so that we can have as little impact on both the environment and our pocketbooks and our labor as possible. And we'll only move up to the next step on this pyramid when we absolutely have to. Foundational for weed management on the IPM pyramid is mulch. So I want to talk about how to use mulch most effectively to suppress weeds in your landscape. Mulch is great because it helps keep water in the soil, which is great for our plants to be growing, suppresses weeds. It also has some effects on soil temperature. The water effects and the soil temperature effects you can use to help coax plants that might be marginal grow along. But this weed suppression thing is really, I think, why most of us are using mulch. And there are lots of kinds of mulch out there. In general, you can separate it into two sorts of buckets. You have organic mulch, mulch made of things that used to be alive. Typically, that's going to be wood chips or bark. And then you have inorganic mulch, rocks. If you are going to use mulch, evidence suggests that the best mulches that you can use are wood chips if you want to use organic mulch, or small rocks if you want to use inorganic mulch. Both of these mulches are good, and you should be using mulch. Notice that they behave differently. And so it's important, if you're choosing a mulch or when you're choosing mulch, to understand how those mulches behave and pick the right one for your situation. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that for weed suppression, your mulch should be 4 inches deep. 4 inches of mulch will suppress weeds. You don't need weed fabric underneath it. That's a separate mulch. You don't need two mulches. You just need one mulch, and it should be 4 inches deep. And if you don't believe me, here's a picture of some test plots down here south of Castle Rock. You can see here the test plot actually extends through most of what you can see up until you hit the weed fabric. And you can see which plots have 4 inches of mulch on them and which don't. Even more dramatically, here's 4 inches of pea gravel in the plots, and here are less deep depths of pea gravel or other mulches. 4 inches of mulch really does work to suppress weeds. Ideally, your mulch is going to be aesthetic and function well for whatever types of plants you're growing. So here I've got native plants. You might think, well, ideally, I'd put rock mulch around those native plants, but wood chips work. So it's important that you use mulch to suppress weeds, no matter what you're growing, but just understand how the different mulches behave so that you can treat them correctly for the plant health of the plants that you're trying to grow, and go from there. All right. Last, in our simple list of just the 3 things that we want from gardens and how we're going to easily get there, doing as least work as possible, is we want to have no pests in our garden, right? So we're going to revisit that IPM pyramid. Remember that we want to do foundational things like cultural practices before we start climbing up the ladder. Included in cultural practices is making habitat for invertebrates that are going to help to manage pests. First, I would point out that the more diverse your garden is, the more resilient it is to pest and disease. And those diseases can be both biotic, it's caused by bacteria, viruses, fungi, and abiotic, things like drought and hail and temperature. So here's a really diverse garden. If I took out any one plant, you'd still have a really lovely garden with lots of full niches. The more diverse a garden is, the more resilient it's going to be to those various insults that can be experienced. And again, don't be tricked by garden style. This is not about garden style. This is about number of types of plants, not necessarily how you arrange them. Now, it's true that if I knocked out these, I'd have a hole right there, but I wouldn't lose my whole border. So diversity is important, and yeah, you might lose a plant or a type of plant, but your garden is going to be resilient. So start there. I will also recognize, though, that depending on your garden goals, resilience might not be the strategy that you want to take not to have pests. For example, if I'm trying to grow squash because I want to eat the squash, accepting that, oh, I've got squash bugs now, so I'm just going to let my squash die, it's not an acceptable program. So you do want to get out there. You're growing a plant for that purpose. It's why it's important to have those garden objectives identified so I can know I need to scout and squish these squash bug eggs right away, or think about how else I might promote those natural foundational pest controls in the garden. Remember also that when you're performing IPM or looking at making habitat for beneficial insects, whether they be pest control agents or pollinators, that habitat is habitat, and whether or not something is a pest involves a value judgment on our part. So if I make habitat for invertebrates, I can expect invertebrates to move in. Just because I have fuzzy feelings and warm wishes about butterflies doesn't mean that only butterflies are going to take advantage of my butterfly habitat. And even if only butterflies take advantage of my butterfly habitat, some of them might still get called pests. So here, for example, it's a swallowtail very happily eating dill, and that's adorable, and I love it. I like to watch it. But if I were a commercial dill producer, I might be upset about this. Similarly, here's a sphinx moth caterpillar that consumed one of my favorite fuchsias completely last summer. And that was really depressing and rage-inducing. But at the same time, I sure like butterflies and moths. So I let it do it, the little jerk, but value judgments all over the place, right? Is this a pest? Is this not a pest? Am I okay with this? Am I not okay with this? Thankfully, I had other things in the container with the fuchsia, so it wasn't a total loss for at least the container. So there's where resilience came in and saved me. But there's value judgments all over for these invertebrate strategies. Here's another, this is a difficult situation, right? Here's a spider, killed another insect. Hooray! Oh, it's a honeybee. Oh no, now I feel terrible if the spider ate this bee. But a honeybee's a non-native invasive species. Maybe I'm fine with this. So really, your own personal value judgments are going to be laden over your garden. Understanding your garden objectives will help you make those and decide whether to accept or not accept what might be going. So if you want to practice natural pest control and have the ecology of your garden help you, then you need to do these three things. You need to learn and recognize and don't kill your beneficial insects. You need to provide habitat, so food for the adult and immature stages, and nesting sites. So if I look at my tomato stem and I see these little bugs, I need to know, are those beneficial or not beneficial? What are they up to there? These are beneficial insects. These are minute pirate bugs that are out there hopefully hunting down thrips. Here you can see another teeny tiny insect. Is this a fungus gnat? No, this is a parasitoid wasp that's going after this rather hefty aphid situation. Here I can see a sawfly larva that was collected off of this dill, and shortly after collection, several alien creatures emerged from it and spun cocoons. And these, again, is a parasitoid wasp. That's kind of sad, I guess, but it's also kind of cool. So when I see these fuzzy cocoons, I need to know, what is this, and do I want it or not want it? Here's a close-up of some of those parasitized aphids. Here's normal aphids. Here's parasitized aphids, beautiful, shiny gold plump aphids. Here's a ladybug, probably the most popular beneficial insect on Earth for pest control. And here are some ladybug eggs. So it's important to be able to recognize, hey, I like these, so I want to keep these ladybug eggs. But these are not ladybug eggs. These are other beetles, foliage-eating beetles that they can hatch. See, they started by eating their eggshells, and now they are happily consuming this leaf. So spending a lot of time in your garden, watching what's happening, and recognizing the insects early on can help you to get ahead of them so that you spend less work. For these little jerks right here, eating this plant, that was the work of less than 5 seconds for my thumbnail, right? If I had not seen that early, because I'm not observing my garden regularly, that could have been a trip to the hardware store, that could have been chemicals, that could have been loss of plants, it could have been all sorts of things that would be more work for me. So spending that time in the garden, I mean, I had a cup of coffee in one hand while I killed those bugs with the other hand. That's garden judo for you right there. Here's some other bugs you might see in your garden that look frightening, but that are helpful. These little assassin bugs called Zealous luridus. This is what their eggs look like. They're a generalist predator. You might find ant lions. Those are pretty cool. This one caught a housefly. I don't know how it did it. It's awesome. Green lacewings, probably the second most popular biological control agent after ladybugs. You can see the eggs. If you see these eggs on long strings, that's green lacewings for sure. And the larvae are kind of creepy looking, right? So if you see this with long jaws, sort of worm-like, you might think, oh no, this is eating my flowers. But in fact, it's not. It's they're hunting pest insects. So recognizing this is going to help me control particularly things like aphids and thrips because this is doing all the work for me, but not if I squish it. We talked a bit about lady beetles already, or eggs. Similarly, their larvae do not look like the adults. So if you see the terrifying orange and black alligator, leave it alone. It is helping you. And then lastly, flower flies, a popular one. These little guys are bee mimics, and they're maggots. Eat aphids, swallow them up. So you see this big juicy thing in your aphid field, leave it alone. It's helping. Generalist predators you're going to see in your garden often. And these honestly, I think are more, they're great. They're killing things, but they're not going to solve a pest problem. They're not going to solve an outbreak, but they're great to have. If you see these things, you know that you are keeping different populations of pests in check because you're having things eat them. You're hired hands, right? You build the habitat to pay them, and then they show up. Spiders, ambush bugs like this one. You might have mantids. Here's a little native brown mantis, teeny tiny. Here's a giant introduced mantis. All of these generalists, they're eating stuff, and that's great. See those? Now, I can just lay back and not moving. And that's not quite right. Because again, if you did this in a judo match, you would get beaten quickly. So just because you can use these strategies to help doesn't mean these should be the only things you do. You still have to put on your judo gi. You still have to get out there. You still have to pay attention. But you're going to be using the momentum of your opponent. You're going to be using the momentum of the plants, of the weeds, of the bugs to help you throw your garden across the room, or otherwise, succeed with whatever your garden objective might be. So remember, get out there and think strategically. And at this point, if there are any questions, I would be happy to take them.
John, we do have a couple questions. And the first is the ruderal plants. Is there a place where a comprehensive list is available to know more about these, or is it just looking up individual plants and understanding where they like to grow and what they do?
So I wish there were a comprehensive list. There's not a good comprehensive list that I have found. It doesn't mean it's not out there. If you were to look, on our big list of resources about plants, floras are places that you can find where it will talk about plants liking disturbed sites. And then also, if you look at peer-reviewed literature, which is going to involve going down to the library or buying a database membership or something, so that you can look up life strategies, you will find studies that have sorted plants by their life strategy, and you can look that way. As a gardener, I think it's easier to ask around. And if you see a description in a garden catalog that something reseeds, that's a good indication that it's probably ruderal and that it really is liking disturbance, and individual plants are liking to generate a lot of seeds and then check out, right? So sadly, there's not a good comprehensive list. You do have to do some homework and footwork to look into which plants would be ruderals. A lot of annual plants are ruderals because that's part of the life strategy. Most perennials that you will buy at a garden center or a nursery are going to be predominantly either competitive or stress tolerant. They may have ruderal tendencies, but annuals are more likely to fit that. And yeah, sorry, there's no weed, but.
No, that's great. There's a reason why weeds are called weeds. Regarding rock or gravel mulch, is there any concerns about the radiant heat that is a potential with these products?
So that is going to depend on your garden objective. So gravel mulch will transfer heat to the underlying soil that will then potentially re-radiate at night. That's a huge problem in Phoenix. That is not a huge problem in Denver. And in fact, in colder places, there's at least one study out of Germany, and there may be others, that demonstrate that you actually get healthier perennials with that warmer soil in the spring and the fall when you're trying to grow native or adapted perennials in a Colorado scape, xeriscape type setting. Wood mulch does not transfer heat to the soil as well, so it's great if you're trying to avoid heat island or nighttime heat radiance, or if you want to keep the soil cool because you're trying to grow beets or a magnolia tree or something like that. But the surface temperature of wood mulch does get very, very hot in the sun. And so that's where if you're using wood mulch, it'd be important to make sure that it's shaded, either by a nice dense plant canopy or trees or something, because the surface of wood mulch can actually get hotter than the surface of rock mulch because that heat's not being transferred to the soil. So again, whether or not you're concerned about the soil temperature being warmer under rock mulch depends on your garden objective. For me, usually I'm not concerned about it, but it would depend on the situation. I like that shoulder season, and I like the surface drainage and water maximization of gravel mulch. It's worth the warmer soil for me.
A couple more questions on mulch. So I know what you're going to say, but like talking about mulch, what's good, what's not so good. It's very site specific, but could you just add a little bit more context to that? So the question, if you want to know, how do we determine what's considered a good or not so good mulch?
So thank you for that context. So knowing your mulch goal is going to be the foundation, and then deciding, and then matching it to your plants is going to be the next thing you want to do. So, for example, if you are growing an unwatered xeriscape garden and you're relying on natural precipitation, your goal might be to maximize how much of that precipitation gets into the soil. And in that case, a gravel mulch will help to get that water, that precipitation into the soil without running off and without being absorbed by the mulch itself. If your goal is to make a pathway that is easy to walk on, easy to maintain, and doesn't have weeds in it, then gorilla hair mulch is a fantastic option because it knits together into that web. Plants don't go through it, and water doesn't go through it the other way. So that is like the cheapest pavement you can make is that mulch. So it does depend really on the garden goal. Wood mulch is great for perennials, especially here if it's getting water, because the water is needed to help decompose the wood mulch. Wood mulch here lasts a lot longer than it will last in places like Oregon or Washington or the Midwest, where it stays wet. Now, I remember hearing people describe, I walk on my wood chip mulch and it feels like a sponge. Now, that is not what wood chip mulch feels like here, because oftentimes it just gets mummified if it's really dry. So wood mulch, if it's in the shade or water, awesome. It's going to be breaking down, building that woodland soil. So if you're looking for those sorts of plants, wood mulch could be an awesome choice. The one thing I will say regardless is that unless you are growing a vegetable garden and using wheat fabric as a mulch by itself, don't put wheat fabric underneath one of those other mulch types because reasons. But the reasons include it's damaging for soil invertebrates, it prevents gas exchange, water going into the soil, which is a study out of Washington State University that demonstrates that pretty clearly. And then lastly, it doesn't actually work for very long. As stuff seeds in on top of it and the soil builds up, or it gets caught on top of that mulch, you get weeds on it anyway. So I'd say avoid rolling out a plastic carpet under your rock mulch. But otherwise, mulch is good and you should use it. And you can't make, I think, like a fatal mulch error either. You might work against yourself, but you're not gonna ruin everything by choosing the wrong mulch.
Thanks, John. And then transitioning to the veggie garden, mulch still. Could you talk about the different biodegradable options, grass clippings, leaves, straw, etc.?
Sure, yeah. I mean, grass clippings and leaves and straw all make great mulches wherever you are, including in the vegetable garden. They get used in vegetable gardens more commonly in perennial plantings because they break down more quickly, and you can often just turn them right into the soil as part of the natural management of the vegetable garden. Again, you want 4 inches deep to suppress weeds. Don't do that with fresh grass clippings or it will stink. But those all are fine organic mulch options, but that depth really is important for weed suppression. And using an organic mulch in a vegetable garden helps to replace organic matter in the soil as it breaks down. It might not be enough to replace what you're harvesting, sort of depends. So again, there's not like, oh, this is the magic silver bullet of mulch. It's use mulch, use what, if you've got a bunch of leaves, use those leaves, they're free, but depth is important, an important consideration. I don't know, does that answer the question? I feel like I'm answering, not really answering, but.
No, it absolutely answers the question. The one thing I would mention about straw is that if you do use it, make sure it's weed-free straw. There are sources to get weed-free straw. And holy moly, because you can have a problem on your hands if it's not weed-free.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point.
Can you mention, we're kind of going down a different rabbit trail, but green manure plants or cover cropping in the veg garden?
Cassie might be able to address this more thoroughly than I can, but I will tell you that from my judo perspective, the idea of a cover crop is to fill niches in your vegetable garden during the time of the year that you are not growing a harvestable product. So the idea is I'm filling this real estate so that I don't have a bunch of weeds come in. The advantage is that I can turn in those cover crops to enrich. But Cassie, please add.
The only thing I would add to that is that cover crops, if you plant like an annual cover crop in the fall, it then dies. You can leave the plant in place and plant into it, and then it's not growing, but it is protecting from weeds coming in.
Covering the soil, yeah, being a recently living mulch, preventing both erosion and weed invasion. Good point.
And the final question, John, if you would tell us about the beautiful pink flowers behind you on your screen and if they're a good selection for Colorado landscapes.
Oh, sure. So right behind me, this is Penstemon secundiflorus, or the side bells penstemon. It grows naturally along a whole lot of the Front Range and out into the plains and sort of oak scrub areas. It is certainly drought tolerant. I think it's beautiful. It is a stress tolerant plant, like many penstemons. Not all penstemons, but many penstemons, which means that a dry, well-drained, lean soil will give you best results. And for this particular variety, you would likely need to start from seed or from a specialty native plant nursery because it's not commonly seen with more floriferous counterparts at garden centers and nurseries.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, John. For Anne, who just asked about penstemons, I do know that our penstemon fact sheet has been recently revised and should be available on the website soon. John, correct?
Yeah, I think the revised one might not show up until July. Penstemon secundiflorus, though, is quite short, so like under a foot tall.
Perfect. And
if you like this, but you want a giant one, sorry, Allison.
Oh no,
I love penstemon, so now we can talk for another hour. If you like the pink look and you want something much larger and that is easier to find, maybe a little easier to grow and more dramatic in the garden, look for Penstemon palmeri, which is also fragrant. So you might have to start that one from seed too, but it's super easy and a great garden.
John, thank you so much. That was amazing. We will post this recording on the Plant Talk website, and we hope you have a wonderful day and happy spring.